Before the creation of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, there were dozens of homesteads and small settlements nestled within what is now the Smokies. Each of these families had their own story. Some have been lost to history. A surprising number have been recorded, either through accounts from the times in which they existed, or from the ancestors of the people living in these remote mountain communities. Today, we'll be visiting the cabin and farm of the Walkers, whose fame came from the daughters born to that family. The Walkers were like many families in the Smokies. They tended to their land and largely lived off of what was produced there. What they couldn't grow or farm, they would trade in nearby cities like Sevierville, Knoxville, and Maryville. And no, despite being from here, I will not be saying Sevierville or Knoxville or Maryville. I apologize, I know. On paper, there was nothing extraordinary about the Walkers. They were an ordinary Appalachian family. What set them aside was that one of 7 Walker girls ever married and left home, drawing interest to the family in their time and ours. Delving into the history of the land's ownership, at least from the perspective of white European Americans, the earliest owner of the land the Walkers occupied was a man named John Renfro, who purchased roughly 2,000 acres in the Little Greenbrier region of what was later the Smoky Mountain National Park in the early 1800s. In 1838, he sold 400 acres of this land to a man named Bryce McFalls, who built a cabin from tulip poplar lumber and sealed with mud and stone on the land shortly thereafter. In 1853, part of this tract was purchased by a man named Wiley King, including the original McFalls cabin and an additional cabin McFalls had built for his sons. In the 1860s, after his release from a Confederate prison in Andersonville, Tennessee, John Walker married the daughter of Wiley, a woman named Margaret Jane King, and together they were gifted part of Wiley's land. On this portion of the property sat the cabin. Other parcels of what Wiley owned were gifted to his other children and their spouses upon marriage. But eventually, John and Margaret managed to buy most all of them out of their deeds, totaling 122 acres total that the couple owned. Though obviously nestled in a mountainous region, the land was partially flat, at least in terms of Appalachian landscapes, and had close access to a creek as well as a spring. The home never had modern plumbing or electricity, even though both would have been options in the later years of its occupation. It also never had an outbuilding, with the family preferring to go in the woods, so none of them had to experience the shame of people knowing what they were doing in an outhouse. As an aside, this is probably something to do with religious upbringing. I know a lot of older folks are very embarrassed to this day of things like going to the bathroom, and a lot of that is just derived from culture, which is mostly rooted around religion in these parts. At first, the Walkers lived in the McFalls cabin as it had been built. As the family grew, John began to deconstruct the other cabin Bryce McFalls had built elsewhere on the property, and used that lumber to construct a kitchen area and porch as additions to his home. You may be wondering why he would choose to tear apart a perfectly usable structure elsewhere on the property instead of just cutting down more trees. At the time, lumber was very hard to process. It was all done by hand, and so when you needed lumber, you would physically cut down a tree. You would split it. If you wanted it to be fancier, you would plane it and scrape the bark off. This was not the case with these cabins. They were tulip poplars that were split in half so that there would be more wood than using just the whole tree, and then slapped together with mud to bind them, more or less. And so with this labor-intensive process, it made a lot more sense to take an existing structure that was not in use and use what had already been processed to bring to the home they were living in, as opposed to John and probably brothers and cousins and whatnot of his to go out into the woods, fell a bunch more trees, haul those back, likely via mule, to where they were currently living, and then build an addition from that. It's a lot less work, and when all you do is work, if you can save time, if you can save effort, you do. Now, even with this addition, it is doubtful that the home was not crowded. In total, it ended up being about 20 feet by 22 feet, and the Walkers had 11 total children, all of which survived into adulthood. This was incredibly uncommon at the time, especially given how remote the farm was, and how the Walker parents did not believe in seeing doctors. A general distrust of doctors was pretty common at the time, especially in more rural communities. Maybe in the city it was more acceptable because there were doctors who were closer and it was more of a commonplace thing. But out in the sticks, especially in Appalachia, it was a lot of using herbal remedies and tinctures and stuff of that nature. At peak capacity of 13 total people in the home, the girls and their parents would sleep downstairs, while the boys slept in the loft upstairs. John, being a craftsman and blacksmith, built all of their furniture, including several beds, and smithed any fixings with the doors and windows and fireplace and such. Siblings shared beds with siblings in the Walker home, likely in an effort to conserve as much space as possible. However, the family would still have to hang anything they could, whether it be baskets or brooms or possibly even clothing, from the rafters so they had any hint of walking room. While today you might see a family of 5 and think, wow, that's too many kids, large families were a blessing in an era where all hands mattered to get the day's work done. John and Margaret married in 1866, and their first child, James Thomas, was born a year later. A year after that, in 1868, they welcomed another son, William Wiley. In 1870, Margaret Jane was born, followed by John Henry in 1872, Mary Elizabeth in 1875, Martha Ann in 1877, Nancy Melinda in 1880, Louisa Ann in 1882, Sarah Caroline in 1886, Hetty Rebecca in 1889, and finally, Giles Daniel in 1891. Though, as previously stated, uncommon today, families this large were rather commonplace in their time. Parents had an expectation of at least some of their children not making it through childhood. Morbid as that is, it was just the fact. Life was harder back then. Child mortality rates were kind of through the roof. With childhood mortality in mind, I'm sure it came as somewhat of a surprise when none of their children perished from what would now be relatively preventable diseases. In one of the few instances where the Walker parents did make use of a medical doctor, 2 of the boys had contracted measles while away at school, which no amount of folk medicine would have cured. Had they chosen a folk cure route and let nature take its course in the matter, it is very likely that they would not be able to boast 11 healthy adult children. As kids tend to do at a certain age, the Walker children began courting. Now, courting back then was a lot different than you would consider it today. Today, you hit up somebody on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever people use, and you say, "Hey, shawty, what that butt do?" Back then, you would physically have to go to the house of a girl you fancied, and you would spend time with her, either supervised by the parents or timed sometimes by a candle, and when the candle would burn out, you gotta leave. And you would get to know a girl, and after kind of an embarrassingly short amount of time, a gentleman would offer his hand to a lady, and they would wander off into the big open and start their little family. Once the Walker children had reached courting age, all 4 Walker boys found wives easily enough. Some of these were from other communities within the nearby mountains, and some were from nearby towns and cities. However, of the 7 girls, only Sarah Caroline managed to find a husband. Though the reasons for why the other 6 Walker girls never married died with them, they all remained in the home they'd been born in until their deaths. 2 sisters, Mary Elizabeth and Martha Ann, had been engaged at some point in their lives, but the prospective spouses of both women died in accidents, and after this, neither ever courted again. It is said that Mary Elizabeth, who was attending Carson Newman University at the time, walked all through the night in the cold and the rain after finding out her betrothed was dead, leading to a severe illness. In her recovery, it was found that her mood had changed entirely, from a mostly pleasant young woman to a more surly one, leading the family to believe that the illness had somehow affected her brain. To me, it seems a lot more likely that she was kind of set on this person being her partner in life, and upon finding out that he had died in an accident, she lost her mind a little bit, as one can kind of empathize with. If you are going to marry a person and then they pass, no doubt that is deeply traumatic and could lead to a lifelong change in your behavior. As previously stated, there is no concrete, definitive proof as to why 6 of 7 girls never married. The most reliable theories as to why include the following. 1. Life on the farm was simply too busy. With all the boys gone off to have their own families, someone needed to stay behind and help John tend the land. 2. Margaret Jane, resigned to never marrying and living life as a spinster, convinced her younger sisters that marriage simply was not worth it. What her reasoning might have been behind this opinion is lost to history, as it does not appear that it was ever recorded. But there are many accounts from various sources, including family members, of her renouncing men, and every younger sibling knows that the opinion of their older sibling matters way more than it probably should. I know, as the oldest of my 4 siblings, there were times where I would have just dog shit opinions, and my younger siblings would parrot those because I'm the oldest, therefore automatically cool up until a certain age, of course. Or I would enjoy something, or I would like something that they otherwise would have no interest in. But because I, as the eldest sibling, enjoyed this thing, they would automatically gravitate toward him. So, when I was reading that Margaret Jane had this strong opinion that marriage was not for her, my immediate thought, as the oldest of my siblings, is it could very well be that they idolized Margaret Jane in a way, that the younger sisters wanted to be more like her in some aspect, and just all, conscious or subconscious, adopted this idea that marriage is not for them. It is also entirely possible that at least some of the girls didn't feel comfortable leaving their father alone. After the passing of their mother in 1909, John would have been entirely on his own without his daughters. Though all of the Walker children had helped with farming their whole lives, it's pretty safe to assume John could not have successfully managed over 100 acres by himself. Having 6 additional pair of hands would have meant survival in more than just the barest bones way. When he died in 1921, the girls still stayed, all well into adulthood at this point. With them all being grown women, it is important to remember that this was a point in time where marriage was a young person's game. Older men could remarry if they had property or homes or some sort of value in that sort, but society was, and still is largely, but more so back then, deeply misogynistic, and a woman's value was in her youth. This is not right, but this is how women were largely viewed. After a certain age, you were not fit for marriage if you were not already married. And so the Walker sisters, all being grown women after their father's death, meant that even if the reasoning behind them not marrying had been John, they would not have been candidates for marriage given their quote-unquote old age. There are also some more Sweet Home Alabama style theories behind why the girls never married or left to live their own lives, but I like to assume the best in people and not accuse people of heinous actions when there is no evidence for it. Some reports also claim that John used to scare off potential suitors, or give them so little time with his daughters that they stopped coming by, So perhaps this is just a case of an overprotective father who overprotected so hard that all the local boys stopped trying. Though the sisters tended to be referred to as more of a collective than separate people, since they were so inseparable, the Walker sisters were all very different from one another. Margaret Jane, named after her mother, was the eldest. She was known for being very serious, even in her childhood, though there is one account from a journal of a cousin of hers of her playing in a quote-unquote frog pond, and then them all getting whooped for playing in said frog pond. She would rarely allow herself to have fun, instead choosing to focus her attention on her work and her faith. She was largely in charge of her younger sisters, as many older sisters find that they are, often being responsible for assigning chores to her sisters, even as adults. It is said that she was an expert marksman and sheep shearer, and that she decided from a young age to never pursue marriage. Mary Elizabeth was also very devout. She dedicated much of her free time to the local church, a primitive Baptist church that was housed in the same building as the local school. She had been engaged to a man named Cotter in her youth, but he perished in an accident. After she recovered from an illness gained while walking in the cold and rain after finding out, she was never the same, transforming from a relatively happy person to almost always being sad. Some reports say the illness messed up her brain. I say she was so heartbroken that she was never able to recover from her loss. Martha Ann was known as the accountant of the family. Any bills or order forms mailed out from the farm had her signature on them, and she helped ensure anything to do with money was taken care of. She was also known to contract herself out to help at nearby farms, so she was not always with the rest of her sisters. Martha Ann had also been engaged in her youth to a man named John Daniels, but he also tragically perished before their marriage. Nancy Melinda was the best seamstress and needleworker of the sisters. She was patient, attentive, and dedicated to her craft. She was also heavily asthmatic, and was the most sedentary of the sisters because of it. Her role in the family was largely indoors, cooking, cleaning, and keeping her sisters clothed. She was also the first of the sisters to die, likely linked to her asthma. Louisa Ann was seen as a jack of all trades. It is said that she could do absolutely anything on the family plot, but there was always at least one sister who was better at that task than she was. Despite not being a master of any skills, she was seen as being an extremely hard worker and a strong person overall. She was also the most whimsical of the sisters, often writing poetry in her spare time. Hetty Rebecca was by far the best cook in the household. She was also the best at knitting. At one point in her life, she had gone to work in a hosiery mill in Knoxville, though that seems to be the only time she ever really left the home. Sarah Caroline was the only sister to ever marry. Her husband, Jim Shelton, was often known to give car rides to the sisters who had stayed behind in Greenbrier Cove, since none of them could drive or even afford a car. She lived nearby, though I could not find exactly where at, and often visited her sisters at their family home, along with her husband Jim and their children. Life on the farm was not easy. Almost all waking hours were spent at work. The sisters had strict, rigid schedules, which meant that they were up as early as 3 to 4 in the morning every day of the week in order to complete all of their daily tasks. And those tasks were never-ending. A barn, pig pen, corn crib, smokehouse, apple house, blacksmith shop, tub mill, and spring house all stood on the property. Upon their father's death, the blacksmith shop went largely unused. Every other aspect of the farm, however, required lots of attention. The barn and pig pen were, probably obviously, used for livestock, of which the Walker sisters kept many. They were known to have chickens, ducks, turkey, sheep, hogs, and cattle, as well as a mule that they used for hauling heavy things, such as lumber, around the property. The livestock largely roamed free in the warmer months, wandering around the mountains to their heart's content, and were stored in the barn or pig pen over winter. Pork was an essential part of the sisters' diet, and so the smokehouse was also an incredibly important feature on the farm. Here, the sisters would cure meat products primarily from pigs butchered before winter began, that would help them last through the rougher months. And if you've never been to Appalachia in winter, the winter months can be very rough. Long before there is snow or ice or anything in the nearby valleys, you can see from as far away as you can see that the mountains in the area will have snow on them. It will be 60 degrees in the valley, but up in the mountains there's snow. And so having a store of food, something that is high in nutritional values, such as pork, high in fat, is essential for surviving these very long, harsh, freezing winters. Also, don't come at me in any comments if you're from, like, New York or anywhere in Canada or something and you want to say, oh, well, you guys are the South and it's not cold. It's cold for us. We're weenies. If it's not 100 degrees with 200% humidity, it's miserable down here. Even if you're used to it, it sucks. All of that aside, corn was another dietary staple. Once harvested, the corn was stored in the corn crib, which is just a fancy word for a storehouse specifically for corn, to be used later. The corn crib was packed to the brim, and the sisters could expect to eat corn with every meal. What wasn't consumed was used to feed their livestock or ground into cornmeal, though their capacity for how much corn the Walker sisters could ground was minimal, given they didn't have the right equipment for larger scale milling. The spring house was a small structure built over a cold water mountain spring found on the property right before the cabin. In this, the family would store milk and dairy products such as cheese and butter, allowing them to keep cool year-round. The apple house was used, unsurprisingly, to store apples from the over 20 varieties, mostly heirloom, that John had grown on the property. I had a hard time finding an exact list of what variety of apples he did grow, but there were reports stating that some of these are so rare today that they basically no longer exist. In addition to keeping livestock, the sisters also grew many crops. We've already established the importance of corn, but cabbage, beans, and potatoes were equally as important. Once harvested, they would often save seeds to grow in the next season, but were also known to order seeds through companies such as Burpee. In addition to vegetables, they also harvested fruits from the trees their father had grown. Though he was mostly fond of his apples, John had also cultivated peach, cherry, and plum trees, as well as some grapevines. He had also begun tending to a handful of chestnut trees as well, though these would later perish in the chestnut blight of the 1930s. Not all seeds they planted were food, however. Some were purely for the vibes. The sisters were fond of their flowers and their herb garden. They were said to have planted over 100 varieties of flowers, but mainly grew hydrangea, yucca, roses, snowball bushes, and bachelor buttons. Many of these plants still grow on the property today. Their mother had taught the girls of herbal medicine as well, and they continued on in that tradition, keeping horseradish, boneset, and peppermint as ready cures in the herb garden. The sisters were reported to have gathered wild sassafras and ragweed for their herbal cures as well. To prepare for the harsh mountain winters, they would preserve whatever crops they could, canning, drying, salting, pickling, or smoking anything they could, ensuring they weren't eating just pork and corn for months on end. Having a stock of a variety of jellies or dried apples and that sort of thing also ensured that they would have enough variety in their diets to not be not malnourished, but just improperly nourished. You can survive on pork and corn, sure, but you're not going to be as healthy as you would be if you have more of a variety in there, different vitamins and nutrients that you cannot get from pork and corn. As the Walker sisters aged, they began to rely more on store-bought goods. One of the sisters, though I could not find which of the 7, had once said that their land gave them everything but sugar, soda, coffee, and salt, all of which they could purchase a short walk away at Jim Metcalf's store in Metcalf Bottoms, or catch a ride into town to visit Lawson's cash store in Sevierville. But as time passed and tending to the land became more of a hassle as the women aged and fell into poorer health, the sisters began to purchase flour, various soaps, hay, cocoa, medicines, and by medicines I mean camphor, milk of magnesia, that sort of thing, and eventually cloth from stores and catalogs. Of these, the cloth struck me as being the most interesting, not because they're ordering cloth from a catalog or purchasing it in a nearby store, but because all accounts reported them as saying that they liked to order denim because denim was a lightweight summer alternative to their homespun. And that just made me wonder, as someone who works outside and wears jeans in the southern heat, just made me wonder how miserably thick their homespun had to have been that denim felt like a lightweight alternative. Now that we've established what a working day would look like for these women, what about their free time? Free time was somewhat of a myth for the Walker sisters, though they would spend what little time they weren't focusing on survival on tasks like weaving. It was said that between the 6 sisters living in the family home, they had spinning wheels going most hours of the day, and from this they would weave their cloth. They would use wool from their sheep, as well as fibers from cotton and flax, which they grew on the farm. John, being good with building things, had built a cotton gin for the family, but it required 3 people to use, 1 person to feed the cotton into the machine, and 1 person at either side of the machine to operate the rollers. As this was the case, it was a very labor-intensive machine to use. Once the fabrics were woven, almost always in a traditional Appalachian pattern made from drafts, which is an example pattern, that they kept, they would be turned into the full-length, long-sleeve dresses the sisters were known for. Whichever sister had made the garment, once sewn, would then embroider her initials into that dress. All dyes were made naturally from plants in the vicinity, such as pokeberries or walnut bark, though many garments were undyed and left in the fiber's natural color. Any scraps from their sewing would be saved for later quilting. The sisters also have said to have made their own shoes, though sources report sometimes that they would order men's shoes from catalogs. In the reports that said that they made their shoes, the base was said to have been of a very fine quality beef hide, which was then greased with sheep or beef tallow, and the laces were made from tanned squirrel hide. Given the time and location and general vibe of the Walker sisters' lives, it is understandable why one might believe that they were all uneducated, but this is simply not the case. Their father, John, had helped to build the Little Greenbrier Schoolhouse, which opened on New Year's Day of 1882. This building also functioned as the area's primitive Baptist church, and all of his daughters attended this school. Despite a common argument of the time being that girls did not need an education, the Walker sisters still made the roughly 1-mile trek to the schoolhouse every day that it was in operation, which was primarily during winter due to the necessity of farming. Here they would learn spelling, reading, penmanship, arithmetic, and language exercises. Most of the children in this school did not progress past the 8th grade, and this is also the case for the Walker sisters. Now, looking at the subjects the girls and other children in the Little Greenbrier School were being taught, you might think that's very basic. This is elementary stuff. This should not be what teenagers are learning. However, what the purpose of school has changed drastically since schools became a thing, really. In America, at least, the beginnings of schools were primarily to teach reading and writing for the purpose of reciting the Bible. And this was also the case with the Walker sisters, where it was reported by various members of the family that they would be most excited to learn to read and write so that they could then read the Bible and write out Bible verses. This is not to insult the education system of the time. People were making do with what they had, and for the majority of people, reading and writing was really all you needed to learn. Today, it is essential to learn a variety of different topics so that you can navigate a much larger world. Keep in mind that the Walker sisters never really stepped outside of East Tennessee. They were in their hollow for most of their lives, just on their farm. They didn't need to know about geopolitical conflict and stuff like that. Whereas today, we are exposed to so much all of the time, and so knowing deeper mathematics, knowing how to properly convey ideas in your native tongue, knowing the history of the world, that is all essential so that you can be the best person you can be in your society. With religion being the primary motivation for an education, and being the time and place in which the Walker sisters lived in, it is no surprise that church was an essential part of their lives. Each Saturday, as was an Appalachian tradition, the women would bathe, which was a daunting task without running water, which required hauling buckets of water from the creek to the house, heating them, placing them in a wooden tub, and then one by one the women would bathe. This also meant that the only person who had clean water was the first woman to take a bath. They would bathe, then arrive to church on Sunday morning clean and in their best clothes. Religion offered them a sense of purpose as well as a social outlet. As the women aged, they were known to travel all over the state for various church functions. They lived simple lives because it is what the church taught. They believed that all one really needed in this life were warm clothes and good food, and everything else would be taken care of once they had died. They were known to all be generous hosts when it came to meals, making space for anyone who showed up at the family home when they rang their dinner bell. They viewed sharing a meal as something very deeply religious to them. Being the generous dinner hosts they were, it was said that the Walker sisters never turned anyone away. It didn't matter who they were, where they had come from. If someone showed up on their doorstep and they were hungry, they would set the table for them and share as much as they could. And as can be expected, they would always pray before their meals. And this was just how life went for the Walker sisters until the 1920s. At some point, whispers began of the creation of a national park in the region. Shortly after, officials began showing up on the Walker family home to tell the family they needed to vacate the property. But they refused to leave. The farm was all they knew, and none of them seemed to like the idea of packing up, moving out, and restarting somewhere entirely foreign to them. When the government began to push harder for them to leave, they demanded $15,000, which today is almost $300,000, which still seems very cheap for over 100 acres, which was far higher than the $3,500 the government was actively offering to them. In what seems to me as a minor act of rebellion, the family then sold timber rights to their farm to a local lumber company. But, for reasons unknown, they never actually logged the property. In 1935, then Park Superintendent J. Ross Incan petitioned the director of the National Park Service to allow the women to stay on their land once the park had officially formed, stating that it would be, quote, considered inhumane here to eject them. This request was swiftly denied, and in 1940, with the grand opening of the park imminent, final demands were made for the Walkers to leave. By this point, both John and Nancy Melinda had passed, leaving but 5 sisters remaining. Still refusing to budge, the sisters were summoned to court against the federal government in 1941. In this, the title for their land was ceded to the park. However, they were also granted a lifetime lease on their property, meaning they were allowed to stay there until they died. They were also granted $4,750 in compensation for their land. While staying in their home was a victory, it also had its drawbacks. No longer were the women allowed to hunt, fish, gather herbs, cut wood, or allow their livestock to graze. This surely would be a solid kick in the balls, given these activities were essential for their survival. The Walker sisters had their home, they had their money, but now they had to rely more on the outside world than any of them cared to do. The sisters had been so resilient to outside influence that the Great Depression hadn't even really hit them. They didn't trust banks, and so all of their money was buried somewhere on the property. They didn't really purchase anything, so they hadn't noticed that there was any scarcity. And now they were having to actively engage with the wider world in order to meet their basic survival needs. The park opened and tourists flooded in, curious to view this new Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Fairly quickly, the Walker sisters learned that they could capitalize on this, and began serving tourists with fresh apple pies, handmade trinkets, and even handwritten poems. Through this, they were able to survive, and continued on this way until but 2 sisters remained alive. They had been mostly welcoming to visitors until then, having had a visitor's welcome sign at the trail that led into their farm. But the last 2 sisters, Louisa and Margaret, requested that the park change this sign to read "No Visitors," to give them some privacy in their final days. By the early to mid-1960s, all sisters who had remained on the family plot had died. Sarah Caroline would pass in the later half of the decade. All Walker sisters and most of the Walker family were buried in the Maddox Cemetery in Wares Valley, laid to rest very close to their home. After all of the Walker sisters had passed, their cabin was off limits for many years before the Park Service began restoration and collecting what they had left behind. In 1976, Great Smoky Mountain National Park began to restore the property, and today the cabin, corn crib, and spring house are all that still stands. As much of the original materials as possible were used to reconstruct anything which was found in disrepair. This obviously could not be done for every single aspect of the farm. It is also safe to assume, given the nature of something like a national park and just basing off of how I see people behave today, that looting and vandalizing had surely happened to the cabin while no one was living there. There is not a corner of the park that doesn't have somebody's name scrolled somewhere. If there's an open rock face or timber anywhere, even trees, there will be a name carved or written onto it. That being said, I would not be surprised if materials from outside had to be brought in order to properly repair the cabin. People are people, and I don't think a couple of decades is going to change that humans really, really like taking trophies. And if somebody happened upon the cabin and saw there was something cool, I would not put it past them to have slipped it in their pocket or their purse and made off with it, and then also carved like Jeff and Bridget were here summer of '82 or whatever seemed profound to whomever was there at the time. I had tried tracking down just how bad the state of disrepair was on the farm, but the park service is not super great at disclosing stuff like that. So I did not find how much work it needed to be reopened to the public. But just, I don't know. I live here. I see how stupid people are with shit. It was probably pretty bad basing off how I've seen people behave. Anyway, in addition to repairs done to the structures remaining at the farm, any items left behind in the cabin were taken by the park and presumably held in a museum somewhere, though I also could not figure out where exactly items from the Walker sisters' cabin are being housed at the time. Though the Walkers lived a lifestyle many of us today could not fathom, it is important to remember the people and places that formed our history, even if they weren't major figures in politics or media. The remains people leave behind are not simply tourist attractions. They tell a story. They are proof that we were here, which anyone who has ever written their name on a toilet door or carved their initials into a tree, like a lot of people visiting the Smokies do, know that for whatever reason this is just a part of humanity. We crave to be known and to know, to connect with those who came before us and to be recognized by those who come after us. If you're ever in Wares Valley, or find yourself in the Metcalf Bottoms parking lot, take the short walk to the Walker sisters' cabin to view the land they loved so much that they refused to leave it until death, to empathize with the fear they must have felt upon learning that they might be forcibly removed from the only home they knew, to get a feel for the simplistic lives they had and be grateful for all that you have. Times change, but humans remain the same. Now, that was my script. My script's over. This is unscripted now, we're just ad-libbing. This is the spring house. So, the water at the bottom here, that is fresh water from a spring. They would keep milk and such in there. It would stay cold year-round. We are walking now up to the cabin. As you can see, very rustic, very cool. To the left, that is the corn crib. We're going to go visit her first. This is Little Miss Corn Crib. Now, pay attention to the ground around the property. So, corn crib. She would be stored with a bunch of corn. That's basically it. So look at the ground. This is something I, at the time, was wondering. I'm going, what in the hell happened down here? Why is the ground awful to walk on? And then I remembered we have wild boar, and that wild boar love to do this. And as soon as I remembered that wild boar love to do this, I remembered that wild boar are big. Even the ones we have out here, they're pretty small. But they're big. Anyway, here's a better view of that corn crib. But then I started getting paranoid about a horde of pigs attacking me. This is one of the puffball plants that the Walker sisters would plant. Now, walking over to the cabin, the ground here is mostly undisturbed, which was kind of nice. It's a little easier to walk on. And approaching a door here. And it is very dark inside. And I, because we have bears, I just knock. Going around different places in the park, I have heard so many park rangers say that you always knock when you enter a building, not only for superstitious reasons, but because bears and elk and whatnot like to hunker down in buildings, and it was raining pretty hard. So I always knock going into places because I don't want a bear to not realize I'm there. And then this damn door, there's so much you can't see behind that door. I've played enough Left 4 Dead. I know there's something back there, but there's not. Anyway, this is the kitchen. That was the cook stove. Going back out here, this obviously is a porch. I am 5'3", and I had maybe 3 to 5 inches clearance above my head. This is very low ceilings. I almost felt like I needed to duck, but I didn't because I'm a short king. Going out here, this is a yucca, which, if you remember from earlier, I discussed that the Walker sisters kept those. And now, going back to the porch, I really fuck with this porch. It's so cozy. And in here, this is where the sisters and their parents would have slept, and then after the parents died, they would have had 6 beds in here in total. And I know what you might be thinking. White people love to just go exploring shit. I'm not going upstairs. That was where the brothers slept, up those stairs. I'm not about that life. I really am curious, but I'm not gonna be the one that gets killed in a cabin in the woods. This is some Skyrim-ass shit. This is some spooky shit. I'm not going upstairs where it's probably even darker. Here I'm just looking at the chimney, trying to figure out what it is. It looked like concrete to me. Apparently that's mud, unless it's concrete from restoration. Again, couldn't find great records on what was going on. You can see more of the rooting up by the boar over on this side of the house. Just kind of looking at the way the boards are stuck together here. It's cool. There's some broken glass because some fuck-ass broke a window. Always something going on. And then I'm just examining the wood because I'm deeply autistic. And that's about it. It's a really cool cabin, and it belonged to some fascinating people from before my time, but, you know, still my home region. Passing by the spring house on the way out, I didn't know at the time what this structure was. I just knew that it was kind of funky and cool. So now it's time for the Speedy Boy portion of the video. This is just where I'm walking back to my car. I don't have a lot to say here, but I'm just gonna talk, I guess. Anybody need anything from the gas station? Need a pack of smokes? Anything from the liquor store? How's everybody doing? Everybody having a good time? Good day? God, I don't even know how this is gonna look. Listen, I have a computer that I bought in, 2020. It's a little dated. It doesn't have the best hardware. And I'm running this footage, because this is almost an hour, that I've condensed into fucking 3 minutes. And I don't even know what it's gonna do with this. My computer's already crashed twice, just trying to speed up the footage, so honestly, this is mostly for me. This is mostly just an experiment to see what happens when I push this piece of crap to its limits. For me, it's showing as little snippets, little bits and pieces of my hike back, even though I have it to where it's supposed to be just smooth, real fast footage, so we'll see. We'll see how that pans out. But anyway, how y'all doing? How do we like walks? I like walks. I'm trying to do part of the Appalachian Trail this spring, which I know is insane. I have asthma. I'm gonna have a hell of a time. First day is looking like it's just straight uphill for 15 miles. And that's gonna be a beast, but I think I can do it, and I think I'll be content to have done it. It'll be a feat for sure. So, Anyway, thanks for watching. Y'all are super cool. If you are still consuming this trash with me just babbling like a crazy person, like, thanks. I'll have more of these kind of videos out at some point.